Hi everyone and welcome to our webinar. It's the first in our series covering COVID-19 in the workplace. My name is Laura Riley and I'm the Head of HR and Compliance at Nicholson's Accountants, and I'm a chartered member of the CIPD as well as the Institute of Leadership and Management. I'm going to be your host today. Many of you will hopefully know by now that we are more than just an accounting firm. We do a lot of business advisory work which is crucial for our clients, and HR is one of those offerings. Joining me today is Lucy Pitfield, who works as our HR consultant. Lucy provides support to external Nicholson's clients with any of their HR queries and issues. Lucy is going to be presenting to you all on some key points about the furlough scheme and other considerations in light of the current pandemic. We're planning to be with you for about an hour or so today, but you aren't tied to joining us for that long. We're going to make the session as interactive as possible, so please engage with us and others in the chat box. Just to give you an idea of format, Lucy's going to be covering furlough in the overall context, laying staff off and short-time working, redundancies, unfair dismissal, and the most important bit, which is bringing staff back to work. We'll then have a Q&A session, which is a brilliant way of you being able to ask us all of those burning questions that you might have and that you want to know the answers to. The way this works is that you type a question into the Q&A box, which is below, and other people get the option to also ask questions, but they can upvote those that they like the best. We're going to go in popularity order. So if you like a question, make sure you give it a thumbs up and it'll push it to the top of the queue and saves you having to write the same thing, but it's more likely to get answered. If there aren't enough questions in the Q&A, we will go to some that have been sent in advance by people who are our clients. However, there is a possibility we won't get to those because we will prioritise always the questions that are asked live on the Q&A. We're going to record today's meeting for the benefit of those who couldn't make it, and also to make it easy for you to recap, and we'll make that available for you shortly after. And I'm now going to hand over to Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So yeah, as Laura said, I'm the HR consultant here at Nicholson's. Just for those of you that don't know me, I am from Lincoln. I grew up in Lincoln. My mum had a shop in Lincoln, and my dad also owned his own business. So it's no surprise that I've actually owned my own business as well. Age 21, I set up a family-run business with my husband and father-in-law, delivering training, which was before I qualified as a HR professional. And now that's where my passion lies, is helping other businesses with any HR and people needs. Okay, so moving on to our first slide. Today's webinar is going to be, as Laura said, around furlough, redundancies and returning back to work. So moving on to furlough. The term furlough comes from the USA and isn't something that we use here in the UK very often. It's obviously new terminology since the coronavirus job retention scheme has come about, and furlough and the job retention scheme is kind of interchangeable in terminology terms. HMRC have set up the coronavirus job retention scheme and obviously giving employers 80% of their wages. The latest statistics show that the job retention scheme protected 7.5 million workers and almost 1 million businesses, and I know that a lot of our clients have used the scheme as well. And the reason for the scheme was to protect the jobs during lockdown, and obviously then hopefully have people going back into the workplace once the lockdown has ended. So moving on to the next slide. The coronavirus job retention scheme runs from the 1st of March until October. It's running the same as it is now until the end of July, and then from August to October, the government have said that they will be an employer contribution and relaxation of the working rules to allow employers to work part-time, but we won't know any more details until the end of May about that. The minimum that you can furlough somebody is for 3 weeks. So if you do have somebody on furlough, then you will need to furlough them for at least 3 weeks in order to be able to claim on the job retention scheme. You will also need a furlough agreement for those that are on furlough, and a lot of our clients have received our furlough agreement, which details when somebody's on furlough, when they've been put on furlough, and the kind of regulations around that. Now, we've had a lot of questions about annual leave and furlough. There's been a lot of confusion around holidays because the guidance came out quite late after the scheme had started. Basically, employees can be on holiday and be on furlough at the same time, and they will also accrue annual leave whilst on furlough. The bank holidays and other holidays will need to be paid at 100%, so the employer will need to pay an additional 20% themselves for those that are on holiday. There's a new temporary law that allows you to be able to carry over 4 weeks of holiday into the following 2 years. Now, the holiday is split up into the European legislation is that everybody must have 4 weeks holiday, which is why they're allowing the 4 weeks holiday. So they're saying that you can actually carry over the 4 weeks into the following 2 holiday years. Now, that's a thing for the employers, so it's up to the employers whether they want to do that. It's not a given right that the employees can do it. It is up to the employers. You can also ask your employees to take holiday at any time, as long as you give them twice as much notice as you're asking them to take. So, for example, if you want to ask them to take a week's holiday, then you will need to give them 2 weeks' notice from the start of that holiday. So, I had one client whose holiday year runs from August to September, and they were worried that once everyone was back from furlough, they'd need to fit in all the holiday. So they decided instead to ask the furlough employees to take some of their holiday whilst on furlough, which the employees were pleased about because they had the additional 20%, and obviously the employer was pleased because they didn't have the issue with the holiday, which I think is quite a fair way of doing it for those that you've got some on furlough and some not on furlough. If the ones that are on furlough are taking their annual leave, it leaves them the ones that are still working. It gives them more opportunity to fit all of their holiday in. Now, to bring somebody off of furlough, you will need to give them as much notice as you can, and it's advisable that you do give them notice. And you also need to be mindful of the fact that that some of them may have childcare issues that they need to address. You know, some of them might have transport issues that they need to look at. So it's advisable to give them as much notice as you can and to bring them off of furlough. Okay, now moving on to redundancies. Obviously, there is going to be a lot of redundancies that come out after the furlough, because a lot of employers are in a situation where they have got a downturn in business. So moving on to the next slide. When we're looking at redundancies, the first thing we need to look at really is there any alternative to the redundancy? There are alternatives such as short-term working or layoff, but there are minimum amounts that you need to pay if you are laying off employees. So if we didn't have the coronavirus job retention scheme, then we would use layoff instead. And an employer would have to pay a minimum of, I think it's about £30 for 5 days. Whilst somebody is on layoff or short-term working, they do have the right to request to be made redundant if they've been laid off for certain periods of time. And if you don't have a clause in your contract, you will need to consult and agree with the employees if you want to lay them off or put them on short-term working. Now, there is a correct legal procedure to laying somebody off. You must consult with staff. Even if it's only, even if redundancy is the only option, you still need to really consult with the staff. You must include why you're being made redundant, give them a chance to come up with alternative solutions, because to be honest, they might come up with an option that you hadn't actually thought about. So it's worth kind of consulting with the employees regarding that as well. You need to have really careful initial planning and preparation for the redundancies, because you need to make sure that it's a fair process. You will need to notify the Department for Business and Innovation and Skills if you're making more than 19 employees redundant. Collective consultation will be required in all cases where more than 19 employees are affected, but it's advisable to consider collective consultation otherwise as well. And to be honest, if you're going through any of this, we can actually help you as a HR department with that as well. You will need to have a criteria for selection, and like I say, you need to make sure that that's a fair selection process. Now, the minimum notice periods, if you've got between 20 and 99 employees to be made redundant, you need to give 30 days notice. And if you've got over 100 employees to be made redundant, you need to give 45 days notice. But the sooner you can start the redundancy process, the better, really. When looking at redundancy pay, you'll need to pay the notice pay. You'll also need to pay the holiday pay. Now, the notice pay will depend on whatever's in the contract. So if you've got a contract with them, in fact, you will have a contract with them, whether it's written down or not written down, you've still got a contract with the employee. But if you have got a written contract, it will depend on the contract as to how much notice you give them. So some employers have 1 week's notice, some have 1 month, and some have 3 months, for example. You'll also need to pay the redundancy pay as well, which also depends on the length of service and the age of the employees. But we can help you work all of that out if you do have redundancy situations. It's also worth noting that the impact that it has on people that are making the redundancies. So when I had my own company and we had redundancies, the actual impact on the directors of the company, it's not something that we kind of considered as we were going through the redundancy process, but it actually had quite long-term impact on them, because at the end of the day, you're having to, it's not a nice thing to do, having to make people redundant, because obviously it's their livelihoods that you're affecting. So it is worth kind of considering that you do need to look after the people that are making the redundancies as well, because it's quite a tough process to go through. Okay, moving on to the next slide. I just want to tell you about an employment tribunal case and see what you think of it. So this case is Pachman, trading as Pachman Lucas Associates versus Fortune, and it was May 2012. Basically, Fortune works as a bookkeeper for Pachman Lucas Associates. There was a reduction in the business, and the use of a new accountancy software meant that there was less work for Fortune and her colleagues. She and the other staff were asked to reduce their hours in line with the reduced amount of available work, but she refused to agree to this. The employer dismissed her, but did not pay her any redundancy payment. Fortune argued that the reason for the dismissal was redundancy, and hence she should have received a redundancy payment. The employer argued that there was no redundancy because there was no reduction in employees' headcount. So what do you think? Do you think that it should have been a redundancy or not a redundancy? Okay, so 80% of you think it should have been a redundancy, and you are right, because the fact that the requirement of the business for the employees to carry out work in a particular kind, or the employees to carry out work in a particular place, was mean that it was made redundant because there was a reduction in the hours. So just because there was a reduction, there wasn't a reduction in headcount, there was still a reduction in work. So yes, it was a redundancy situation. Okay, now moving on to returning back to work. If I can have the next slide, please. And the following slide. Okay, returning back to work after furlough. The first thing we need to look at really, is it right that you return back to work? Now, obviously we've had some quite specific guidance this last week or so regarding the fact that some employers should return back to work. But you also need to consider whether it's right for your organisation, because not every organisation it will be right for. Obviously, you need to consider the social distancing measures that you need to put in place, and you need to have a clear rationale for returning to work and why you need each role physically in the workplace. You also need to look at the criteria that you're using to recall staff, and is it fair and non-discriminatory? So, you know, is it a fair process that if you're only bringing a certain amount of people back initially, if you're going to do a phased return and bring some back and not others, then, you know, the people that you're selecting to bring back, is it fair that you've asked those to come back? You also need to think about the health and safety considerations of bringing people back. So obviously, like I've just said, things like the social distancing, staggering working hours, you might be able to kind of stagger the working hours to ensure that you've got the social distancing. Maintaining working from home where possible. So if you've already got your employees working from home, then it's advisable to keep them working from home at the moment. Also looking at PPE, personal protection equipment, and if it's needed in the organisation, and if you are going to be using PPE, then you need to make sure that your employees are trained on how to use that PPE. Cleanliness as well, so carrying out deep cleaning before you return to work, ensuring that you have regular hand washing within the organisation, and you've got hand washing facilities within the organisation and you've got enough of those. You can bring in temporary hand washing facilities. I've seen these kind of pods that you can kind of bring in for cleanliness and hand washing as well. You need to regularly wipe all of the equipment in high traffic areas. So if there is equipment that's being used by a lot of people, then obviously that needs to be wiped regularly. And you also need to consider staff travelling as well. So public transport, you know, whether that's safe for them to go on the public transport, and also have virtual meetings where possible rather than bringing people all in together. Mental health and well-being. It is worth noting that a lot of people are going to be very anxious about coming back to work. They're going to be scared about getting the infection. They're going to be anxious about juggling childcare. They might have financial worries because, you know, a partner at home might have been made redundant, so they might have financial worries as well. They might have illnesses, and also they might have bereavements to deal with as well, because obviously people are being, you know, are dying due to the coronavirus. So they might have that to contend with. I would definitely recommend looking at employee assistance programs if you do have issues of anxiety in the workplace and mental health issues, because an employee assistance program would be there to kind of help and offer support and assistance to your employees. So it could be counselling support, it could be financial advice. You can do it via the phone, so it's, you know, offering phone advice and things, and it's just that extra kind of support that you can put in for your employees that your line managers might not have the capability to deal with. Also, when you're bringing the employees back to work, I would recommend reorientating them and reinducting them into the workplace, because things might have changed since they've been in lockdown. We would recommend that managers have one-to-one return meetings with the employees, and we can, you know, we've got copies of those to give you as well if you need one-to-one return to work meetings. We can help you with those. Also, health and safety and well-being. You know, looking at the actually having that conversation with them and checking that the employees are, you know, they have got the well-being in there. Also, any adjustments and ongoing support that they might need coming back to work. So they might need, they might request being on shorter hours, for example. You know, you might have situations where you might need to make adjustments for them. Also, there might be a change of service or procedure that you might need to talk to them about. So it might be that you've put in a one-way system within the workplace, so people are only going a one-way round building. You might have just maximum numbers in certain areas of the building, and obviously all of the employees need to be told about that, as you would do in a normal induction process. They might have change in working duties or tasks as well. So you know, they might have additional duties that they need to have. So there might be different packing mechanisms. You might have thought of different ways of keeping people, employees and customers safe. So they obviously need to be told about that. And also they might want to have a phased return to work, or you might want to have phased return to work. So you might want them to come back just in the mornings to start with, or you might want them, they might want to come back part-time, or you might want to have certain people in on certain days. So you might just have you know, some people in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and other people in Thursday, Friday, to have a shorter, less people in the same space in any one time. Whilst doing all this, you also need to be mindful of making sure that you've got an inclusive culture. So even if you've got employees that have got people at home that are working on the front line in the NHS, for example, you need to make sure that they're not singled out and that they're kept together in the workplace, so that other employees don't single them out and, you know, say that they don't want to work with them or things like that. You need to make sure that everybody's in an inclusive environment, and you need to just be mindful that of harassment and bullying in this situation, that it doesn't occur. So it's just something else for you to kind of think about. Now, giving people notice to return back to work, you need to give people as much notice as you can, like I say, to organise the things that they need to organise at home. And I'd also recommend giving the notice in writing as well. And again, we can help with that if you need help. Now, also talking about COVID-19 illnesses. Obviously, if you have an employee that is coming back to work but then contracts the virus or thinks they have symptoms of the virus, they will need to self-isolate for 7 days. If a member of their family has coronavirus, then the employee will need to isolate for 14 days. You can be paid, the employee can be paid 2 weeks for statutory sick pay, and that can be claimed from day one. Now, the statutory sick pay, we haven't got any information yet about when that's going to be released as to, you know, how we're going to claim that back, but we expect it'll be through a portal, the same as the coronavirus job retention scheme, and we're expecting that to open at the end of May. It's also both the employers and the employees' responsibility to make sure no one with COVID-19 symptoms are at work. So it's not just the employee that says, oh, well, I'm fine, you know, I've had a bit of a cough and a temperature, but I'm actually fine to work. Actually, you know, you've got a duty of care to all of your employees. So you do need to think about, well, actually, if they've said that they've got those symptoms, then they probably need to stay at home and you need to make sure that you're clear on, yes, you will need to stay at home at that time. Now, employees might, insist on wanting to come into work because obviously the financial impact of going down to statutory sick pay, they might just say, oh yeah, I'm going to come in anyway. But like I say, it's really, you need to be mindful that you've got a duty of care to everybody in your organisation, and you need to make sure that they're self-isolating in line with the government guidance. Now, we have put a pack together that covers the risk assessment, returning to work for managers, furlough return to work letter, plus some guidance notes, and we'll be sending these out to our retained clients. But if anybody else would like a copy, then please get in touch and you can buy those as well. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This slide kind of looks at the funding implications of, or options, I suppose, of employers being able to fund coming back to work. So we've been working with our business advisory colleagues because one of the issues is how we're going to fund the reopen. I think it's accepted now that for most of the businesses, pre-COVID-19 income is not going to return overnight. Our advisory colleagues believe that the shape of the curve coming out of the lockdown may be very gradual, and that poses a problem in terms of funding fixed cost employees. So take, for example, a manager in your business who has been on furlough leave, but who you need to return to work before you can reopen. Their employment costs will be included together with the basket of other costs such as PPE, cleaning, etc. This may cause the cash flow to spike, as shown in the green line. For some businesses, there may be cash in the business, or that can be injected by owners to support this. However, most there won't be that many to be able to put in. The Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, or more commonly known as CBILS, and the Bounce Back Loan Scheme are designed to help by providing funds that can be used to pay for these costs. These loans may also be used for restructuring costs, including redundancy payments. If you want to talk to one of our advisory colleagues, please let us know, get in touch and we can refer you to those. Okay, moving on, we have some questions. And I think Leanne is going to ask some questions next.
Hi there, yeah, thank you, Lucy. We've had some really good questions coming in from people. So as Laura said before, I'm going to ask them in popularity order. So the most popular question has come in from Anna Hart, who wants to know, if I'm making a colleague who is currently on furlough redundant, can the employer use the furlough to fund the colleague's notice pay?
Yes, yeah, you can fund the notice pay with the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. So like I said before, the notice periods will depend on contracts, etc. But yeah, you can actually use the use that money. But it is worth noting that there is contractual notice. If the contractual notice is no more than 1 week greater than the statutory notice, it will need to be paid at 100%. So if you do have a situation where you're not sure of how much notice you need to give or things like that, then just get in touch and we can help you with that.
Thank you. Chris Kirkwood wants to know, what will the redundancy process be for staff during furlough, i.e. how much notice will we need to give them?
Okay. So like I say, it will depend on the contractual, on the contract. Now the notice periods will also depend on the statutory minimums as well. So if you don't have a contract and you don't have it written down in the contract, it will be the statutory minimums of notice that you will need to give for redundancies. And like I say, you can start the redundancy as soon as possible. If you know that you're going to make redundancies, then I would recommend that you do that as soon as possible, and you do it all in one go. So it's very unsettling for employees to go through redundancy processes, and it's unsettling for the organisation as well. So I would recommend that you do it all, you do the redundancies all in one go. Okay.
Thank you. Sharon Roby would like to know, can you start the voluntary redundancy process whilst furlough is happening, i.e. can you ask if anyone is interested in voluntary redundancy after the furlough ends?
Thank you. Yes, you can. You can start the redundancy process whenever you want to, and that will include any voluntary redundancies. So yeah, you can ask them whilst they're on furlough to do that.
Okay, thank you. Chris Kirkwood would like to know if the furlough extension letter can ask employees to take a proportion of their holiday whilst they're still on furlough. So if, for example, they wanted them to take some holiday in July, could they ask them to do this?
Yes. Yeah, in the short term, yeah, short answer is yes, you can ask employees to take holiday, but like I say, you need to make sure that you're giving them at least twice as much notice as you're wanting them to take. And yes, you can put that in the extension letter. So obviously we knew to start with that the furlough was going on until the end of June. Now it's been extended into the end of July as it is. Then if you want to send them a letter to say, we're going to extend your furlough, and we also would like you to take some holiday in that time, as long as you're giving them that notice, then yes, you can do that.
Okay, thank you. Simon Summers would like to know, if you're working from home, I assume you have not been furloughed.
Yes. Yeah, that's right, Simon. So if you're actually doing work from home, then you're not furloughed, and you can't do any work whilst you're on furlough.
Thank you. David Jockles asked, can employers extend the requirement for taking holidays over a 3-year period instead of a 2-year period?
So the answer to this is you can, any holiday that's allocated now, so the holiday that you're allocating now, you can roll over into the following 2 years. So you can roll it over into the following 2 years. Now it's worth noting when you do that you say which holiday is from which year when you're rolling it over. So for example, you can't roll this holiday in this current year that we're in now over to the 3rd year, but it might be that you would want to roll over the next year's holiday into the following year, and you can only do that if you offer more than the statutory minimum holiday. So the statutory minimum holiday is 5.6 weeks a year, which equates to 28 days if you're a full-time employee, and that includes bank holidays as well. So if you roll over some of the holiday from this current year into next year, then they will need to, you can only do that for 2 years. But if you give your employees, say, 25 days plus bank holidays, then you could, if you wanted to, roll those additional 5 days into the 3rd year, but not the holiday from this current year.
Okay, thank you. David Jockle again has asked, if I bring back a furloughed worker for a week and then furlough them again, do I need a new furlough agreement?
Yes. Yes. For every year that for every period of furlough that you have, you will need an agreement. And it's important that you do have that agreement in writing and you do keep it for 5 years. HMRC are saying that they want to go back and retrospectively check the furlough, and I think there will be audits coming from HMRC around this, and they're saying that you need to keep those furlough agreements for 5 years. So you will need an agreement for each of your periods of furlough. You will also need to make sure that each period of furlough is at least 3 weeks. Now you can have furlough, an employee can be furloughed for 3 months, as long as you're having that period as at least 3 weeks.
Okay, thank you. Teresa Mack has asked, how much notice do we need to give when changes occur to working hours, and can this be changed weekly or monthly due to the business needs?
Now, in terms of giving notice on that, basically you need to make sure that you're giving reasonable notice. So if you, as much notice as you can give, the better, really. And I think it's a case of kind of working with the employees and explaining the situation and talking to them about it, and you know, giving them as much notice as you possibly can for any changes that occur.
Okay, thank you. Paul Mills has asked, so you say employers need to deep clean the offices prior to return. Is there any guidance as to what this constitutes, as it sounds like a recipe for expensive and unnecessary cleaning offers?
Yes. Yeah, Paul, I agree. It is one of those things, and I think different organisations will have different needs in terms of cleaning. I think really you need to have a look at the Health and Safety Executive website. Hopefully there'll be some guidance on there as to, you know, what cleaning actually needs doing. But I would say that all of the high traffic areas need cleaning and need wiping down, you know, with antibacterial agents and things like that. So if you're just in a small office like you are, then, you know, the door frames, you know, places where people are going to touch quite often, like the printers, you know, if somebody uses somebody else's computer for whatever reason, then it will need to be wiped down afterwards, and things like that. But yeah, it's worth kind of keeping an eye on the Health and Safety Executive website to see whether there's any further guidance that comes out about that.
Okay, thank you. Alice Kirk has asked, can an employee come back to work and then be put back on furlough at some point? And do they need to work for a certain amount of time before being re-furloughed?
Yes, you can an employee can have more than one stint of furlough, one period of furlough, I should say. Yes, so you can have more than one period of furlough, and there's no kind of minimum amount of time that they have to be back at work, but I would recommend at least one clear calendar day between periods of furlough, just because of how the coronavirus job retention scheme is claimed. You'll need to have that, and each period of furlough will need to be at least 3 weeks. It's also worth thinking about the fact that each period has to be at least 3 weeks, and you can have as many periods of furlough as you want to, yes.
Okay, thank you. Anthony Bryant has asked, can people on furlough undertake technical and personal development training? And does this also stretch to internal projects and management improvement tasks, such as reviewing processes? None of these tasks would be revenue generating or would affect current day-to-day tasks. It would just be preparing for when they do return to work.
So the rules around furlough is you cannot do any work whatsoever whilst on furlough, but training is encouraged. If somebody is doing training whilst on furlough, then they will need to be paid at least the national minimum wage. So if somebody is on national minimum wage, then really it's saying that they can only do 80%, spend 80% of their time on training, because that would be their minimum, that would be in national minimum wage. So you need to make sure that they're doing, you know, they're only doing training for the hours that the furlough job retention payment will cover, so their 80% of their salary will cover. Now the second part of that question, can they do projects and things, then I would say no. Even though it's not money generating, it is still classed as work. So even things like, you know, clearing out your inbox and checking through emails and things, you would actually do that in work anyway. So you can't do that whilst being on furlough. If you did need somebody to do any work whilst they're on furlough, then you can bring them off furlough early if you want to, but it just means that you won't be able to claim on the job retention scheme. So if you have a situation where, you know, you've got an employee that you need them back in the office to do these projects, but they haven't hit the 3 weeks, you either wait for the 3 weeks and then claim that, be able to claim on the job retention scheme. Or if you're desperate to come back, you can bring them back if you want to, but it just means that you won't be paid that 80% on the job retention scheme.
Okay, thank you. Anna Hart has asked, do we know yet whether an employer can keep colleagues on furlough, whether at 80% or less, from August to October, if the employer does not have the work as yet for colleagues, even at a part-time rate, to prevent redundancy?
To be honest, we don't know yet. I would say yes, you probably will be able to, because obviously they're saying that the furlough scheme will extend until October, but to be honest, I don't know. Because we're waiting for the guidance to come out at the end of May. They're saying that they will give us more guidance at the end of May as to how the August to October furlough scheme will work. So yeah, we'll just have to wait and see on that one, I think.
Okay, thank you. David Jockle has asked, what is the risk to an employer if an employee believes they have contracted COVID-19 in the workplace?
So the risk to the employer, you need to make sure that you're giving all the measures that you possibly can to ensure that your employees are safe in the workplace. If you're unsure that if you're unsure that your systems are safe, then I would say it's not worth the risk. It's not worth reopening. So yeah, I think you need to be a little bit careful with kind of making sure that you are as safe as you possibly can be in the workplace, because then that will, and as long as you can prove that you've done that, you're reducing the risks. You're reducing the risks as much as you possibly can, and making sure that you've got a risk assessment. You've done a COVID risk assessment, which again is in the pack if you want that, and making sure that you've got it all written down, documented, that you've got that in place.
Okay, thank you. An anonymous attendee has asked, if an employee refuses to return to work from furlough as they think there is a risk or someone they live with is shielding, can I sack them?
Now, this is an area that we need to be very careful about, because if an employee thinks that they are at risk and there's I can't remember the terminology, but it's something like there's an imminent risk to life, then they have a right not to come into work. So if you are, for example, not following the guidance to the letter and you're not keeping everybody social distanced and things like that, then they have a right to say, no, I'm not coming in because it's not safe. But I think in these situations, you need to just sit down with the employee and talk about why they think they're not safe, have that discussion with them, and make sure that you are doing everything you possibly can to ensure that they are safe in the workplace, and explain to them why you think that you're doing everything you can. They might come up with suggestions that actually, no, you're not doing everything. I think you ought to do this as well. Then you can take that feedback on board from your employees, and then kind of do that. But if they refuse to come into work, if you've got all the measures in place and they are refusing to come into work, then you can take measures for that, yes.
Okay, thank you. Chris has asked, we were about to do a disciplinary meeting for a staff member just before we had to shut down due to COVID. Can we still do this if they are furloughed?
Yes, yeah, you can still, whilst people are on furlough, you can still go through employee relations issues like disciplinaries. It is a voluntary thing though, so the employers need to be able to voluntarily come in and do those disciplinaries, or you obviously do them via web link or whatever, however you think that's safe to do it. It's also worth noting that the managers that you've got on furlough, excuse me, the managers that you've got on furlough, you might need their input as well for for the disciplinaries and redundancies and things like that, which you can actually ask them to do whilst they're on furlough. So yeah, if it's disciplinaries, you can do those whilst on furlough, because it's not actually classed as doing any work. It's just the kind of employee relations side of things. And it's also worth noting you can contact your employees while they're on furlough to check on them, make sure they're okay, keep them up to date with developments and things like that as well. And I'd definitely advise doing that, just so that you're keeping your employees in the loop.
Okay, thank you. We've had another anonymous question that says, who should lead a redundancy process? If it's in a charity, should it be the executive lead or the voluntary trustees, specifically if the executive lead is possibly the post at risk?
So I would say have the most senior person, you know, above that person, so that they're basically their line manager. I would recommend that the line managers do the redundancy process in line with HR to make sure everything's done correctly. So yeah, I would have the most senior person, but if that's the case that it's, you know, the most senior person above that person is, you know, there's only them at the top, then I would probably go to the board of trustees if it's in a charity to do that, or somebody else that's, you know, maybe on the same level as them, because obviously you can't make yourself, you know, you can't be having that conversation and that consultation with yourself. It does need to be in line with somebody else.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. And our final question from the Q&As today has come in from Sharon Roby. She would like to know, can an agreement for a voluntary redundancy be made on a date to be agreed once it is known when the furlough scheme is coming to an end? i.e. your redundancy date will be the date when the government 80% payments come to an end, which allows the employees to benefit from the maximum furlough payments before redundancy takes effect.
Yes, I mean, just because you've got the statutory minimum redundancy notice periods, you can actually have longer periods if you want to, and that's, you know, that's a normal situation. If somebody has to give a week's notice, it doesn't mean to say you can't give them a month's notice, for example. So you can actually have dates in the future as to the furlough, the dates, but you will need a date, because you will need that to work out the accrued holiday pay, the redundancy payments, and the notice payments. You will need, you can't kind of just say it's going to be whenever the furlough scheme ends. You need to have a date at some point, but it can be a date further in the future than the statutory minimum redundancy notice.
Thank you, Lucy. I think we're handing over to Laura now.
Great, thanks guys. So that just about brings us to the end of today's webinar. We hope that you found it useful. We're going to be running these every month, and they are exclusively available as part of our HR partner package. And I know some of you are on that, but there are a huge amount of benefits from being on that particular package, and this being one of them. If you want to find out a little bit more, then please get in touch with Lucy, HR Mail at nicholsonsca.co.uk. The address is also on the slides, just in case you didn't write that down in time. As always, we love feedback, so if you've got any thoughts on future topics or the format, then you can fire it across and we'll be happy to consider it. Our next webinar is going to be on remote working, how to lead and manage a remote workforce. We hope to see you all then, as it promises to be a very interesting topic. Bye bye for now.